It happened before most people were awake, before the morning shows, before the palace press briefings, before the carefully worded statements and polished smiles. At dawn, under heavy security and deliberate silence, Prince Harry crossed a line the world was told he would never cross again. He returned to the palace. No announcement, no cameras, no warning. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And if that alone doesn't make you sit up straighter, here's the question that should. If Harry swore he was done with that life forever, why risk everything now? Because this wasn't a sentimental visit. It wasn't a family reunion. And it definitely wasn't a photo op. This was urgent. This was secret. And according to multiple whispers circling the royal ecosystem, this return detonated a private crisis that left Meghan Markle absolutely furious. Not disappointed. Not confused. Furious. And before you assume this is just another chapter in a long-running royal soap opera, ask yourself something honestly. Why now? Why quietly? Why break years of carefully constructed distance in the one way guaranteed to ignite every unresolved tension still smoldering beneath the surface? Because stories like this don't surface randomly. They surface when something has already gone wrong. Let's slow this down. For years, we've been told a clear narrative. Harry left the palace. He broke free. He chose independence, California, and a life beyond royal control. He spoke openly about pain, trauma, and betrayal. He drew a line in the sand so firm it felt permanent. So permanent, in fact, that many believed he would never set foot inside palace walls again unless dragged there under the worst circumstances imaginable. Yet here we are. A secret return. No public acknowledgement. No shared narrative. Just a sudden, silent reappearance that raises more questions than answers. Who authorized it? Who knew in advance? And perhaps the most explosive question of all, did Meghan know before it happened, or did she find out the same way everyone else eventually did, after the fact? Because if she didn't know, this isn't just a royal issue. This is a marital one. Think about what this moment represents. For Harry, the palace isn't just a building. It's history. It's pressure. It's expectation. It's everything he publicly said he needed to escape to survive. Returning isn't neutral. It's symbolic. It's emotional. It's deeply loaded. And for Meghan, the palace isn't just a place either. It's the origin of conflict, criticism, and trauma. It's the institution she believed had failed them, undermined them, and forced them into exile in the first place. So when Harry crossed that threshold again, quietly, privately, without explanation, it didn't just reopen doors. It reopened wounds. Now ask yourself this. If the return was harmless, why the secrecy? Why avoid the press? Why no coordinated messaging, no controlled narrative, no softening language? Because secrecy usually means urgency, and urgency usually means pressure. Sources close to palace operations often say the same thing when something truly serious happens. You won't hear about it right away. You'll hear about it sideways, through whispers, through sudden shifts, through people acting differently than before. And that's exactly what happened here. Phones went quiet. Schedules shifted. Statements were delayed. And across the ocean, in California, something else was happening. A reaction. Sharp. Emotional. Uncontained. Because Meghan wasn't just dealing with a headline. She was dealing with a decision made without her control. And control, as anyone who's watched this saga unfold knows, has always been central to survival. Let's talk about timing. This didn't happen during a public reconciliation phase. It didn't happen alongside warm gestures or symbolic outreach. It happened suddenly, quietly, and with no attempt to soften the blow. That timing matters. When people return secretly to places they swore off forever, it's rarely because they want to. It's because they feel they have to. So what could possibly force Harry's hand? Was it family? Was it fear? Was it pressure from forces far older and more powerful than public opinion? Or was it something else entirely? Something that couldn't be handled from thousands of miles away? Here's where the story turns from dramatic to dangerous. Because the palace doesn't operate on emotion. It operates on leverage. It doesn't chase. It summons. And when it moves quietly, it's usually because it already knows the answer before the question is asked. Which brings us to Meghan. Imagine finding out that your partner, the person who built an entire public identity around breaking free with you, has gone back to the very place you believed was closed forever. Imagine learning that decision wasn't a discussion. It was a conclusion. That kind of moment doesn't cause mild disagreement. It causes shock. It causes betrayal. It causes rage. And those close to the situation describe exactly that. Not screaming chaos. Not tabloid theatrics. But something colder. Sharper. More strategic. Because Meghan's fury wasn't just emotional. It was rooted in what this return symbolized. Loss of narrative control. Loss of unity. Loss of the carefully curated image of independence they built together. And once that image cracks, the consequences ripple outward fast. Public perception shifts. Alliances wobble. Future plans suddenly feel uncertain. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't a spontaneous trip. It couldn't have been. Palace security doesn't scramble overnight. Protocol doesn't bend without reason. Gates don't open quietly unless someone very high up allows them to. Which means this return was anticipated on one side, just not the other. And that's where the tension explodes. Because if Harry was summoned, the palace made a calculation. And if Meghan was excluded from that calculation, it sends a chilling message about where power still resides. Not in California. Not in public narratives. But behind closed doors, where tradition still speaks louder than interviews. So what happened inside those walls? We don't have transcripts. We don't have photos. We don't have official statements. But we do have reactions. And reactions often tell the truth faster than words ever could. Harry returned quieter than before. More guarded. Less aligned. And Meghan, according to insiders, was not blindsided. She was outraged. Because this wasn't just about a visit. It was about trust. Trust that decisions would be made together. Trust that lines drawn would stay drawn. Trust that the past wouldn't be reopened without consent. That trust, in one silent return, was shaken. And once shaken, it doesn't settle easily. Here's the unsettling part. This may not have been the end of the story. It may have been the beginning of something far bigger. Because returns like this don't happen in isolation. They happen at crossroads. They happen when choices must be made. When allegiances are tested. When the future demands clarity. And clarity often comes with consequences no one is ready to face. So ask yourself one final question before we move forward. If one secret return was enough to ignite fury, fracture unity, and expose old power structures still very much alive, what happens when the real reason behind it finally comes out? Because what Harry did next, and how the palace responded, would change everything. But what Harry did next, and how the palace responded, would change everything. So let's go back to that morning. Because this story doesn't start with anger in California. It doesn't start with whispered reactions or strategic silence. It starts with movement. A question for you before we go any further. How do you return to a place you swore you'd never see again, without anyone noticing? You don't arrive through the front gates. You don't smile for cameras. You don't wave. You slip in quietly. Early. Under protection that isn't meant to be seen. And that's exactly what happened. This wasn't a return designed for reconciliation. It was designed for invisibility. Harry didn't want this moment recorded. He didn't want it dissected in real time. And more importantly, the palace didn't want it discussed before it was done. Because once the world knows you're back, the power shifts. So the goal was simple. Get him in. Keep it quiet. Control what comes next. Now think about that. Harry, the man who once accused the institution of suffocating him, walked back into the same environment under rules he didn't set. No press freedom. No independent optics. No personal narrative. Just protocol. And that alone tells us something crucial. This return wasn't about healing. It was about necessity. Let's talk about how the palace works when something truly sensitive happens. They don't send emotional invitations. They don't negotiate publicly. They don't beg. They apply pressure slowly, calmly, invisibly. Phone calls that don't leave records. Messages pass through intermediaries. Language that sounds optional but isn't. And when the moment comes, the choice presented isn't really a choice at all. So ask yourself this. If Harry had refused, what would have happened? That's the part no one wants to say out loud. Because refusal only works when both sides have equal leverage. And in this situation, leverage didn't live in California. It lived in history, in legacy, in things Harry can never fully escape, no matter how far he travels. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Harry left the palace to reclaim control. Yet his return proves the palace still had enough control to summon him back. That realization alone is unsettling, because it means the story we were told, the clean break, the permanent distance, the irreversible choice, wasn't as solid as it appeared. And Meghan understood that instantly. But we'll get to her in a moment. First, we need to understand how the return actually unfolded. There were no last-minute airline paparazzi photos. No obvious signs. No social media breadcrumbs. The timing was precise. Early enough to avoid attention. Late enough to ensure full security coverage. And once inside, Harry didn't roam freely. He didn't reconnect casually. This wasn't a nostalgic walk through memory lanes. This was a controlled movement from one secure space to another. That detail matters. Because when someone is allowed in but not embraced, it means the door was opened for a reason, not for them. Inside the palace, rooms aren't neutral. They communicate status. They signal hierarchy. And Harry's placement spoke volumes. This wasn't the return of a prodigal son. This was the arrival of someone whose presence needed to be managed. Now pause for a second and ask yourself something uncomfortable. If this return was truly about family, wouldn't there have been warmth? Wouldn't there have been visible effort to soften the moment? Instead, there was silence. Silence isn't accidental. Silence is strategy. And the strategy here was clear. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be. Don't give Meghan time to respond publicly. Don't allow speculation to build before the internal objectives are met. Because yes, objectives. Harry wasn't brought back for closure. He was brought back for something specific. And when someone is summoned under secrecy, it's usually because what needs to be said can't be trusted to distance. Words spoken over the phone can be ignored. Words spoken inside those walls carry weight. That's why Harry came. And that's why Meghan's reaction was inevitable. Let's shift focus for a moment. Imagine you're Meghan. You've built an entire public identity around stepping away from royal control. You've defended that choice repeatedly. You've framed it as survival, as empowerment, as clarity. And then, without warning, your partner re-enters the very system you both positioned yourselves against. Not publicly, not collaboratively, but privately. That detail alone changes everything. Because privacy in this context doesn't mean intimacy. It means exclusion. And exclusion, especially when power is involved, cuts deep. Sources close to the situation describe the moment Meghan found out not as explosive chaos, but as something colder. Silence. Processing. Then anger. Not the kind of anger that vents and fades. The kind that recalculates. Because Meghan didn't just see a visit. She saw a crack. A crack in unity. A crack in trust. A crack in the story they've been telling together. And once cracks appear, people start to question what else might be fragile. That's the real danger here. Not what happened inside the palace, but what this return implies. It implies Harry still responds to palace authority. It implies decisions can be made without joint consent. It implies that when pressure is applied, lines once declared permanent can be crossed. And Meghan knows what that means for the future. Now here's where things get even more complicated. Because the palace didn't just summon Harry. It did something else at the same time. It waited. It didn't leak immediately. It didn't announce. It didn't provoke. Why? Because waiting allows reactions to reveal themselves. If Meghan exploded publicly, the narrative would frame her as emotional. If she stayed silent, the narrative would frame her as sidelined. Either way, control shifts. That's not coincidence. That's calculation. And Harry was caught in the middle. Think about his position. Pulled back into a world he claimed nearly broke him. Facing authority figures he publicly criticized. Knowing his return would devastate the person who stood beside him when he left. There is no comfortable version of that moment. Which leads to an uncomfortable truth. Harry didn't return because he wanted to. He returned because something outweighed the cost. And that something hasn't been revealed yet. But its gravity can be measured by one simple fact. This return happened without a plan to explain it. No prepared statement. No coordinated messaging. No attempt to soften the fallout. That suggests urgency. And urgency usually comes from fear. Fear of loss. Fear of exposure. Fear of consequences. So what was at stake? Was it security? Legal pressure? Inheritance matters? Information that couldn't be handled remotely? We don't know yet. But we do know this. The palace doesn't move unless it has leverage. And Harry doesn't comply unless he feels cornered. That collision leverage meeting fear, is what produced this return. And Meghan felt it immediately. Because for her, this wasn't just about where Harry went. It was about what he didn't say before going. No joint decision-making. No shared strategy. No sense of partnership. That absence is louder than any argument. And once silence settles between two people who built their survival on unity, the damage isn't instant. It's cumulative. Trust doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes. And erosion is harder to repair than a single break. Now consider what happened next. Harry returned from the palace quieter, more guarded, less forthcoming. Not because he wanted to hide, but because he couldn't speak freely. That's another tell. People who return from meaningful reconciliations come back lighter, more open, more hopeful. Harry came back constrained, which suggests whatever happened inside those walls didn't resolve anything. It complicated everything. And Meghan noticed. That's when fury set in, not because she wanted control for its own sake, but because she recognized the pattern. The palace doesn't negotiate openly. It isolates. It applies pressure. It creates wedges. And Harry walking back in alone gave it an opening. That's why this moment matters so much. This wasn't just a visit. It was a signal that the palace could still reach him. A signal that distance didn't equal independence. A signal that the past wasn't done collecting its debts. And signals like that don't disappear quietly. They ripple. Through relationships, through public perception, through future decisions that haven't been made yet. So before we move on, let me ask you this. If the palace was willing to bring Harry back once, secretly, under pressure, what would stop it from doing it again? And if Meghan already sees that possibility, how long do you think she'll tolerate living under its shadow? Because what happened next didn't stay contained. It crossed the ocean. And when it did, the fallout wasn't subtle. Who knew? And who was kept in the dark? That's the question that exploded quietly behind the scenes. Because once Harry crossed that threshold and then crossed it back again, the real story wasn't where he went. It was who knew before it happened. And more importantly, who didn't. Let me ask you something uncomfortable right up front. If you were about to make the most consequential decision of your marriage, one that directly involved the very institution your partner believes traumatized her, would you tell her first? Or would you convince yourself that telling her later would somehow be easier? That question sits at the center of everything that followed. Because this return didn't just expose palace power. It exposed a fracture in communication that had been quietly growing for a long time. Here's what we know about how information moves inside the palace. It doesn't travel in straight lines. It doesn't move democratically. And it certainly doesn't wait for emotional readiness. Information flows vertically, quietly, through trusted channels that have existed for decades. When something sensitive is about to happen, the circle tightens. The fewer people who know, the less chance of leaks. And leaks are the one thing the palace fears more than public outrage. So the question isn't whether people knew. It's who is deemed necessary to know. Because necessity, in palace logic, has nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with hierarchy. And that's where the problem begins. From the palace perspective, Harry is still Harry. A prince by blood. A son. A link in a chain that predates modern media and public opinion. Meghan, however, has always existed outside that logic. No matter how visible she is. No matter how influential she's become. In palace calculations, she is adjacent, not central. That's not emotion. That's structure. And once you understand that, the silence makes sense. Because this return wasn't framed as a family discussion. It was framed as a necessity involving Harry alone. That framing explains everything that followed. Now let's talk about what silence actually looks like in moments like this. It doesn't mean no one speaks. It means conversations happen selectively. Phone calls made to intermediaries. Messages delivered with careful phrasing. Language designed to avoid creating records. Nothing overt. Nothing explicit. Just enough information to move the piece where it needs to go. And Harry, whether he liked it or not, was still a piece. Now imagine being Meghan and sensing something is off before you know what it is. Messages unanswered. Energy shifted. That subtle feeling you get when someone is carrying information they haven't shared yet. That's not paranoia. That's intuition. And intuition tends to sharpen when trust has been tested before. So let's examine the most explosive possibility. What if Meghan didn't know before Harry left? Not speculation. Not rumor. Just logic. If she had known, there would have been a strategy. a preemptive narrative, a coordinated response. Instead, what we saw was silence. And silence is rarely a sign. Because then the conversation isn't just about the decision. It's about exclusion. And exclusion hits differently, especially for someone who has already felt sidelined by the same institution. Let's pause here and ask a direct question. How would you feel if the one place you never wanted to go back to suddenly regained access to your partner, without you being consulted, not invited, not informed, not considered? That's not just hurt. That's destabilizing. And destabilization triggers a very specific response. Control. People seek control when they feel it slipping. And Meghan felt it slipping, not just from Harry, but from the narrative. Because this return didn't just threaten private trust. It threatened public perception. If Harry can quietly return, what else can quietly shift? If lines can blur once, they can blur again. And once audiences sense that ambiguity, the story no longer belongs to the people telling it. It belongs to the people watching it. That's dangerous. Now let's talk about what happened after the return, the immediate aftermath. Harry didn't announce it. The palace didn't confirm it. But energy changed. And people close to the situation noticed. Meetings postponed. Decisions delayed. A sudden recalibration of tone. That doesn't happen unless someone is scrambling. Scrambling to align narratives. Scrambling to assess fallout. Scrambling to determine what can still be controlled. Because once Meghan realized what had happened, and yes, she realized, the issue wasn't just anger. It was clarity. Clarity that the palace still had a pathway to Harry that bypassed her entirely. And that realization is chilling, because it means future decisions might not be joint decisions. It means leverage exists where she believed it had been severed, and leverage changes dynamics instantly. This is where many people misunderstand Meghan's reaction. They frame it as jealousy, as insecurity, as drama. But that misses the point completely. This wasn't about possession. It was about power. Power over decisions. Power over narrative. Power over the future they were building. And that power suddenly felt compromised. Now here's the part most people don't want to acknowledge. Harry may not have intended to exclude Meghan, but intention doesn't erase impact. And impact is what lingers. Because once someone realizes they can be left out of a decision this big, they start questioning everything that came before it. What else was decided without me? What conversations happened I wasn't part of? What assumptions are being made about my role? Those questions don't disappear. They multiply. And when they multiply, trust doesn't just erode. It recalibrates. Now let's zoom out for a second. Why would the palace benefit from keeping Meghan out of the loop? Because division weakens resistance. A united front is difficult to manage. A fractured one is easier. And the palace understands that better than anyone. It has survived centuries by playing long games. Games that don't rely on confrontation, but on patience. So if this return created tension between Harry and Meghan, even unintentionally, that tension serves institutional interests. That doesn't mean it was maliciously planned, but it does mean it wasn't avoided. And that distinction matters. Because avoidance requires empathy. And empathy has never been the palace's strongest tool. So now we're left with a critical turning point. Meghan knows something shifted. Harry knows he crossed a line. And the palace knows it still holds influence. That triangle is unstable. And unstable structures don't remain quiet for long. Something has to give. Either trust is rebuilt through transparency, or control is reclaimed through strategy. And Meghan is not someone who sits still when strategy is required. So the question becomes, what did she do next? Because the moment she realized she had been kept out of the loop, she also realized something else. The story was no longer just about Harry's return. It was about who would control what came next. And that battle was only just beginning. Meghan's reaction didn't happen in public. That's the first thing people get wrong. There was no explosive statement. No dramatic Instagram post. No carefully leaked quote framed to wound. Because the most dangerous reactions are the quiet ones. And this one was quiet. Let me ask you something before we go any further. When someone realizes they've lost control, truly lost it, do you think they lash out immediately? Or do they go still? Because stillness is where calculation begins. And that's exactly what happened. At first, there was disbelief. Not denial, disbelief. That brief, suspended moment when your brain refuses to accept that something has already happened without you. When you replay the facts again and again, hoping they rearranged themselves into something less threatening. Harry went back, quietly, without telling me. Those 3 facts don't soften no matter how many times you repeat them. And once disbelief faded, something colder took its place. Recognition. Recognition that this wasn't just a miscommunication. It wasn't just bad timing. It wasn't just Harry being impulsive. It was structural. And structural problems don't fix themselves with apologies. Now let's talk about anger, real anger, because it doesn't look the way movies tell you it does. Real anger doesn't scream. It doesn't throw objects. It doesn't demand attention. Real anger withdraws. It reassesses. It catalogs. It remembers every previous moment that suddenly makes sense in hindsight. And Meghan has always been someone who processes emotionally before she moves strategically. So what was she processing? First, the humiliation. Not public humiliation. That would have been easier to manage. This was private humiliation. The realization that decisions of enormous consequence were still being made without her involvement. That stings differently, because it doesn't just hurt pride. It undermines legitimacy. And legitimacy matters when your entire public role has been defined by partnership. The image of unity, of joint decisions, of shared exile. That image cracked in one silent trip. Then came the deeper anger. Not at the palace. That anger was already there. But at Harry. Because this wasn't the first time he'd been pulled emotionally in 2 directions. And every time it happens, it reopens the same wound. The wound of uncertainty. Is he fully out, or just temporarily away? That question has haunted their relationship since the beginning. And this return didn't answer it. It made it louder. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. Because anger doesn't exist in a vacuum. It looks backward. And when Meghan looked backward, she didn't just see this moment. She saw a pattern. Moments when Harry hesitated. Moments when he deferred. Moments when his loyalty seemed divided between the life he left and the life he built. Those moments were survivable individually. But together, they formed a map. And that map pointed back to the same place every time. The palace. That realization is what turned anger into fury. Because fury isn't just emotional. It's existential. It's the feeling that something you believed was settled is suddenly unresolved again. And unresolved questions are dangerous in a marriage built on high-stakes decisions. Now let's address something directly, because it matters. This wasn't about jealousy of a building. It wasn't about resentment of tradition. It wasn't about ego. It was about safety. Meghan believed leaving the palace was necessary for survival, emotional, psychological, reputational. And when Harry returned without her consent, it challenged that belief. Not intellectually, emotionally. It raised a terrifying possibility. What if the palace never really let go? What if distance was only an illusion? And what if, when pressure increases, Harry will always feel that pull? That's the fear underneath the fury. And fear, when combined with anger, produces resolve. Now let's talk about how that resolve expressed itself. Not through confrontation. At least not immediately. Because confrontation requires vulnerability. And Meghan wasn't ready to be vulnerable. She was ready to protect. Protect herself. Protect her children. Protect the future she believed she was building. So instead of erupting, she observed. She watched Harry closely. His tone. His silences. His hesitation when certain topics came up. And what she saw didn't reassure her. He wasn't relieved. He wasn't lighter. He wasn't comforted. He was guarded. And guarded people are carrying weight they can't share. That weight became another source of anger. Because secrecy, once introduced, becomes contagious. One withheld detail invites another. And suddenly the relationship isn't just strained, it's opaque. Now imagine living inside that opacity. Wondering what was said. Wondering what was promised. Wondering what might be expected next. Because the palace doesn't summon people without expectation. And expectations don't disappear just because someone leaves the room. This is where Meghan's fury sharpened into something else. Determination. Determination to regain footing. Because whatever else this was, it wasn't neutral. Harry's return altered the balance. And balance matters when power is involved. So let's talk about power. For years, Meghan has been portrayed as the powerful one. The strategist. The driver. The architect of the post-palace life. But this moment flipped that narrative on its head. Because suddenly, the most consequential decision in years had happened without her input. That doesn't just bruise power. It exposes its limits. And exposed limits demand response. Now here's the part most people never see. Meghan didn't just react emotionally. She reacted analytically. She asked herself questions most people wouldn't think to ask in the heat of anger. Who facilitated this? Who had access to Harry that I didn't? Who benefits from me being sidelined? And how quickly could this happen again? Those questions don't come from jealousy. They come from awareness. And awareness changes behavior. That's why her fury didn't explode outward. It turned inward, into strategy, into recalibration, into contingency planning. Because Meghan understands something instinctively. If you can't stop a system from reaching your partner, you have to change how that system interacts with your life. And that means choices. Hard ones. Now let's be honest about the emotional toll. Anger like this isn't clean. It coexists with sadness, with disappointment, with the quiet grief of realizing that something you believed was finished isn't. Meghan didn't just feel betrayed. She felt tired. Tired of fighting the same battle in different forms. Tired of thinking the past was behind them only to see it resurface. And that exhaustion fed the fury. Because exhaustion removes patience. And patience is what allows people to excuse behavior they shouldn't. Now let's talk about the moment things shifted again. The moment Meghan realized this wasn't just about Harry going back. It was about what the palace now knew. They knew they could reach him. They knew he would respond. They knew they didn't need her permission. That knowledge is power. And once power is revealed, it doesn't disappear. It waits. So Meghan faced a reality she didn't want to acknowledge. The palace wasn't done with Harry. And that meant it wasn't done with her either. Even from afar. That realization reframed everything. Past interviews. Past statements. Past positioning. All of it suddenly existed in a new context. Because if Harry could be summoned quietly, then the story of total separation was incomplete. And incomplete stories invite reinterpretation. By the media, by the public, by the institution itself. That's dangerous territory. And Meghan knew it. Which brings us to the most important point of all. Her fury wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. Survival of identity. Survival of autonomy. Survival of the future she believed she was securing for her children. When survival instincts activate, emotions become focused. And focused emotions lead to decisive action. But not immediately. First comes silence. And Meghan went very quiet. Not absent. Not disengaged. Quiet. And that quiet terrified people who knew her well. Because silence from someone like Meghan doesn't mean indecision. It means preparation. Preparation for a move that hasn't been revealed yet. A move designed not to react to the palace, but to outmaneuver it. And that's where this story pivots. Because while the world speculated about Harry's return, Meghan was already thinking several steps ahead. About leverage. About boundaries. About what she would, and would not, tolerate going forward. And that internal reckoning led to a conclusion that changed the tone of everything that followed. The realization that this wasn't just a crisis. It was a test. A test of loyalty. A test of partnership. A test of whether the life they built could withstand the gravity of the one they left behind. And tests don't end quietly. They end with choices. Choices that define futures. So the real question isn't whether Meghan was furious. She was. The real question is what fury like that produces. Because what she did next wasn't emotional. It was intentional. And once that intention crystallized, there was no going back. Why did Harry break his own promise? That's the question that sits like a weight in the center of this entire story. Because promises like the one Harry made aren't casual. They aren't said lightly. And they certainly aren't broken quietly unless something powerful forces the issue. So before we talk about what pulled him back, let me ask you this. What does it take to make someone return to the very place they publicly described as suffocating? Not nostalgia, not guilt, not sentiment. Those things create hesitation, not action. Action comes from pressure, and pressure was everywhere. Harry didn't just leave the palace physically when he moved to California. He left it symbolically. He spoke about pain, about control, about the cost of growing up inside a system that never asked whether he was okay, only whether he was compliant. That's not language people use casually. That's language people use when they believe a chapter is closed. So when that same person reopens the door, something extraordinary has happened behind the scenes. Let's talk about what Harry promised, not just to the public, but to himself. He promised he would protect his family from the life he believed harmed him. He promised he wouldn't repeat the cycle. He promised he would never again allow palace priorities to override personal well-being. Those promises weren't symbolic. They were survival mechanisms. So breaking them wasn't weakness. It was desperation. Now let's strip away the speculation and look at the psychology. Harry is someone who has spent his entire life under observation. Every move scrutinized. Every mistake amplified. Every emotion managed for optics. When someone like that finally escapes, the relief is real, but so is the fear. Fear that escape isn't permanent. Fear that the system will find a way back in. Fear that something unresolved will resurface. And unresolved things always do. Here's the contradiction at the heart of Harry's decision. He left to reclaim control, but the very act of leaving created new vulnerabilities. Distance creates independence, yes, but it also creates exposure. Because when you step away from an institution that has protected you, however imperfectly, you lose more than control. You lose insulation. And insulation matters when storms gather. So what kind of storm could override everything Harry said he would never do? Let's explore the possibilities, not as rumors, but as forces. First, fear. Fear doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like urgency. Sometimes it looks like compliance. Sometimes it looks like telling yourself this is just temporary. If Harry believed something was coming that he couldn't stop from afar, returning might have felt like the only option. Not a choice. A containment strategy. Second, obligation. Harry was raised in a world where obligation isn't optional. It's ingrained. It's internalized so deeply that saying no feels like betrayal, even when saying yes feels like self-harm. That's the trap of institutional upbringing. You can leave physically, but psychologically, the hooks remain. So when the palace reached out, not emotionally, but formally, it didn't trigger nostalgia. It triggered conditioning. And conditioning is powerful. Third, leverage. This is the most uncomfortable possibility of all. Leverage doesn't have to be malicious to be effective. It can be subtle. Legal complexities, security considerations, matters involving children, issues involving legacy or inheritance, things that don't make headlines, but shape decisions. If Harry believed something essential was at risk, the promise to never return suddenly became negotiable. And when promises become negotiable, it means something else has taken priority. Now here's where Meghan's fury makes even more sense. Because from her perspective, Harry didn't just break a promise. He reprioritized. And reprioritization without discussion feels like betrayal, especially when the reprioritization involves the very institution she believed they had escaped together. But let's stay with Harry for a moment. Because it's easy to frame him as indecisive. That would be a mistake. Harry isn't indecisive. He's conflicted. And conflict is far more destabilizing than indecision. Indecision delays action. Conflict forces it. When two identities collide, the prince and the private man, something has to give. And in this moment, the private man lost. Not permanently, but enough to matter. Now let's talk about something rarely acknowledged. Harry didn't just return to the palace. He returned to judgment. Judgment from people who never believed he'd truly stay away. Judgment from people who assumed California was a phase. Judgment from people who quietly waited for him to blink. And blinking once is all it takes to validate those assumptions. That's a heavy burden to carry. Because once you validate someone else's patience, you lose some of your own power. Harry knew that, which means his return wasn't naive. It was calculated under duress. Calculated not to reconcile, but to manage fallout. Now ask yourself this. If you were Harry, caught between a marriage built on breaking free and an institution that never truly releases its grip, where would you feel safest making a move? Not in public. Not with cameras watching. Not with commentators ready to dissect your every expression. You'd move quietly. You'd minimize witnesses. You'd hope the damage could be contained. That's exactly what he did. But containment is rarely permanent. Because actions speak even when words are silent. And Harry's action spoke loudly. It said, I still answer when called. Even if I don't want to. Even if it costs me. Even if it destabilizes everything I've built. That realization didn't just anger Meghan. It frightened her. Because fear isn't about what happened. It's about what could happen next. If the palace could compel this return, what else could it compel? If Harry could bend once, could he bend again? Those questions don't have comforting answers. Now let's address the emotional toll on Harry himself. Returning didn't bring relief. It brought weight. After this return, the relationship between Harry and Meghan was no longer defined by shared escape. It was defined by unequal access. The palace had access to Harry. Meghan didn't. That imbalance is corrosive because it creates a hierarchy where there shouldn't be one. And hierarchies inside marriages don't stay quiet. They demand resolution. Now here's where the story tightens. Harry didn't just break his promise to Meghan. He broke a promise to himself. And people who break promises to themselves often overcorrect. They become defensive. They become withdrawn. They become desperate to justify what they've done. You could see it in his behavior afterward. Less openness. More guarded responses. Avoidance of certain topics. Those aren't signs of clarity. They're signs of internal conflict. And internal conflict doesn't remain internal forever. It spills into tone, into decisions, into moments that don't seem connected until suddenly they are. So let me ask you this. If Harry broke his promise because he felt he had no choice, what happens when that feeling returns? Because systems like the palace don't apply pressure once. They test boundaries. They observe responses. They adjust. And this return gave them valuable information. It told them Harry would respond to urgency. It told them distance didn't equal immunity. It told them the door was not sealed. And once a door is proven functional, it becomes a tool. That's the danger Meghan saw immediately. Not just the return, but what it enabled. Now consider the emotional aftermath. Harry is torn. Meghan is furious. The palace is silent. That silence isn't peace. It's anticipation. Because the palace doesn't close chapters. It waits to see how they unfold. And unfolding requires time. Time for relationships to strain. Time for trust to erode. Time for choices to become unavoidable. Harry broke his promise not because he wanted to, but because something forced him to confront a truth he didn't want to face. The truth that leaving didn't sever every tie. The truth that independence is fragile. The truth that the past has a longer reach than he hoped. And that truth set off a chain reaction that no one could stop. Because once a promise like that is broken, the next decision becomes harder. And the one after that harder still. Which brings us to the most dangerous part of all. Harry's return wasn't the end of the pressure. It was proof the pressure worked. And now that it's worked once, the palace knows something it didn't know before. It knows where Harry's breaking point is. And knowing someone's breaking point is the most powerful leverage of all. Because what the palace did next wasn't loud. It wasn't public. But it was decisive. And when Harry realized what was being asked of him now, the stakes became impossible to ignore. This wasn't Harry's idea. That's the part most people miss. The secret return wasn't born out of nostalgia or regret. It wasn't a late-night emotional decision or a sudden change of heart. It was the result of a move made elsewhere, quietly, deliberately, by an institution that never stopped watching him. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever noticed how the palace never reacts the way you expect it to? When there's scandal, it waits. When there's outrage, it stays silent. When people demand answers, it offers none. But when it wants something, it doesn't ask. It creates conditions. And those conditions are what forced Harry's hand. Because the palace didn't say, "Come home." It said something far more effective. It said, "This can't be handled from where you are." That sentence doesn't sound threatening. It doesn't sound emotional. It doesn't sound coercive. But it is. Because embedded inside it is a message Harry understands better than anyone else. You are still responsible. Responsible for what? That's the question. And the answer is what made refusal impossible. Let's talk about how palace pressure actually works, because it's nothing like the dramatic portrayals people imagine. There are no shouting matches. No ultimatums delivered with anger. No emotional appeals. There is calm. And calm, in a system built on hierarchy, is far more powerful than rage. The palace communicates pressure through implication. Through what isn't said. Through what is delayed. Through what suddenly becomes urgent. And urgency is the lever that moves everything. Harry didn't receive a dramatic summons. He received information. Information framed as necessity. And necessity removes choice. Now consider this. If the palace had simply asked Harry to return, he could have said no. But that's not what happened. Instead, the palace created a situation where not returning carried consequences. Consequences that couldn't be ignored without risk. Risk to whom? Not the institution. To Harry. That's the key. The palace never endangers itself. It externalizes risk. It positions the individual as the potential point of failure. And once someone feels like a failure is possible, especially when legacy and family are involved, compliance becomes self-preservation. So what kind of move creates that level of pressure? Let's explore the mechanics. First, the timing. This happened at a moment when Harry's distance had already created complications. Not public ones, private ones. Things that require signatures. Conversations that can't happen over encrypted calls. Decisions that demand physical presence. The palace understands something deeply. Distance protects you emotionally, but it weakens you structurally. And once enough structural threads are pulled, distance stops being an advantage. It becomes a liability. Second, the framing. The palace didn't frame this as a reconciliation. It framed it as resolution. And resolution implies unfinished business. Unfinished business implies responsibility. Responsibility implies obligation. And obligation is Harry's Achilles heel. Because no matter how far he goes, no matter how independent he becomes, that word still carries weight. He was raised on it. He was trained for it. He was praised for it long before he ever understood what it would cost him. So when the palace framed this situation as something only he could resolve, it activated decades of conditioning. Not loyalty, duty. And duty doesn't ask how you feel. It asks whether you'll comply. Now here's where things turn uncomfortable. Because the palace didn't just create pressure. It applied it selectively. Others could be informed later. Others could be shielded. But Harry needed to know now. And that urgency was intentional. Because urgency narrows options. It doesn't allow time for joint discussions. It doesn't allow time for strategy sessions. It doesn't allow time for emotional processing. It creates a window. A small one. And within that window, the simplest path is often the one taken. Go. Handle it. Come back. That's likely how Harry rationalized it. This is temporary. This is contained. This doesn't change anything. But temporary actions can have permanent consequences. And the palace understands that better than anyone. Now ask yourself this. Why didn't the palace include Meghan? Why not loop her in to avoid fallout? Because inclusion would have complicated things. Inclusion would have slowed the process. Inclusion would have invited negotiation. Inclusion would have reintroduced resistance. And resistance is what the palace wanted to avoid. So it didn't confront Meghan. It bypassed her. And bypassing someone is one of the oldest power moves in institutional playbooks. You don't fight the strongest voice in the room. You go around it. And in doing so, you redefine who the decision-maker is. That's what this move did. It reasserted an old hierarchy. Harry is the point of contact. Harry is the responsible party. Harry is the one who must answer. Meghan was not addressed because she wasn't considered essential to the resolution. That's not personal. It's institutional. And institutional decisions rarely care about emotional fallout. They care about outcomes. So what outcome did the palace want? Not reconciliation. Not healing. Not even silence. Control. Control over a situation that was beginning to drift beyond its reach. Because here's something few people consider. Harry's distance didn't just protect him. It limited the palace's ability to manage future scenarios. And institutions hate unpredictability. They crave containment. So when something emerged that threatened to spiral, something we still don't fully see, the palace moved to contain it by bringing Harry back into proximity. Proximity restores leverage. Now let's talk about the tone of that encounter. This wasn't a warm invitation. It wasn't a welcoming embrace. Harry wasn't told, "We need you because we love you." He was told, "This situation requires your presence." Those are very different messages. One appeals to emotion. The other appeals to responsibility. And responsibility is far harder to refuse. Especially when refusal carries implied consequences. Consequences Harry likely understood without needing them spelled out. Now think about what that does to a person psychologically. You're not choosing to return. You're choosing to prevent something worse. That mental framing changes everything. Because once you convince yourself you're acting to avoid harm, almost any action becomes justifiable. Even breaking a promise. Even risking your marriage. Even reopening doors you swore were sealed. And that's the tragedy of this moment. Harry didn't return because he wanted to re-enter that world. He returned because he believed not returning would cause damage he couldn't live with. And that belief didn't come from nowhere. It was cultivated. Subtly. Patiently. strategically. Now let's examine what happened once Harry arrived. He wasn't greeted with celebration. He wasn't welcomed back into the fold. He was ushered, directed, contained, because this wasn't about restoring his status. It was about resolving an issue, and resolution, in palace terms, often means agreement. Agreement to what? That's the question. Because agreement doesn't always mean signing documents or making public statements. Sometimes agreement means silence. Sometimes it means restraint. Sometimes it means not doing something in the future. And those kinds of agreements are far more powerful than anything written down, because they rely on mutual understanding. And mutual understanding is exactly what Harry was forced to confront. Now imagine realizing this mid-process. Realizing that by returning, you've already conceded something. You've acknowledged authority. You've acknowledged relevance. You've acknowledged connection. And once acknowledged, those things don't disappear again easily. That's why Harry returned changed. Because he understood what had just happened. He understood that the palace had made a move, and it worked. And he understood the cost, not just to his independence, but to his marriage, because he knew Meghan would see this for what it was, not a visit, a precedent. And precedents are dangerous, because they become references. The next time pressure is applied, this moment will be remembered. Remember when you came back last time? Remember how you handled it? Remember how it worked out? That's how leverage compounds. And the palace plays the long game. Always has. Now here's the part that truly shifts the story. Harry didn't just realize he'd been maneuvered. He realized how cleanly it was done. No public backlash. No visible conflict. No immediate consequences. From the palace's perspective, it was a success. From Meghan's perspective, it was a warning. And warnings don't get ignored twice. Because now the question isn't whether the palace can force Harry's hand. It already has. The question is whether Harry will recognize the next move before it happens. Because there will be a next move. Institutions don't test leverage once. They test it again, just to be sure. And when Harry realized what the palace expected from him going forward, the stakes became clear. This wasn't about one return. It was about future compliance. About expectations that hadn't been voiced yet. About boundaries that were about to be tested again. And that realization landed hard. Hard enough that when Harry left the palace that day, he wasn't relieved. He was unsettled. Because he understood something terrifying. The palace didn't need to fight him. It just needed to wait for the right moment. And that moment had arrived. But what Harry didn't know yet, what none of them fully understood, was how Meghan would respond once she grasped the full scope of what the palace had just done. Because she didn't just see a move. She saw a strategy. And when she saw that strategy clearly, she began preparing a response of her own. One the palace never anticipated. And once that response began to take shape, the balance of power shifted again. But this time, the shift wouldn't be quiet. It would be visible. And when it finally surfaced, no one would be able to pretend this was just a misunderstanding. Because the next phase wasn't about pressure. It was about fallout. The pressure didn't stay at the palace. That's the part people underestimate. They think whatever happened inside those walls stayed contained there, that Harry left it behind the moment he walked back out. But pressure doesn't work like that. Pressure follows. And when Harry returned to California, he didn't come back alone. He brought tension with him. Unspoken. Heavy. Lingering. Let me ask you something before we go further. What happens to a marriage when one person crosses a line they promised never to cross? And the other person knows it wasn't accidental? Not suspects. Knows. Because at that point, the issue isn't the action. It's what the action reveals. And what Harry's return revealed shook the foundation of their relationship in ways no interview or headline ever could. This wasn't about a visit. This was about fracture points. And every relationship has them. They're the places where pressure exposes truth. Where compromise ends. Where alignment breaks. And this moment landed directly on one of the most sensitive fracture points in Harry and Meghan's marriage. Control. Not control in the caricatured sense people like to throw around. Not dominance. Not manipulation. Control as an agency. Who decides? Who informs whom? Who gets final say when stakes are high? Until this moment, the answer had always been clear. They decided together. They moved together. They presented a united front, even when the world doubted it. But Harry's return disrupted that unity. Not loudly. Quietly. And quiet disruptions are the most dangerous of all, because they don't announce themselves. They surface later, in tone shifts and hesitation, in conversations that don't quite land the way they used to, in moments where one person realizes they're no longer certain where the other stands. That's what happened here. Harry didn't come back defiant. He didn't come back apologetic either. He came back, altered. And Meghan noticed immediately. His words were careful, his explanations incomplete, his answers oddly rehearsed. Not lies, something more unsettling. Omissions. And omissions are where trust begins to decay. Because when someone omits details, the listener fills in the blanks. And the blanks are rarely charitable. Now imagine being Meghan in that moment. You already know the palace bypassed you. You already know Harry went back without consulting you. And now you're faced with a version of him who can't, or won't, fully explain what happened. That combination doesn't just create anger. It creates instability. Because stability in a marriage comes from predictability, from knowing how your partner will respond under pressure, from believing you understand their values even when they're tested. This moment shattered that predictability. And when predictability disappears, anxiety fills the space. Not dramatic anxiety, quiet anxiety. The kind that asks questions late at night. What if this happens again? What if next time is bigger? What if I don't find out until after it's done again? Those questions don't fade on their own. They linger. And every time Harry hesitated, every time he softened language about the palace, every time he avoided a direct answer, those questions grew sharper. Now let's talk about the emotional contradiction Harry was living in. On one hand, he wanted to reassure Meghan. On the other, he couldn't fully explain himself without reopening the very pressure he was trying to contain. So he walked a tightrope. Reassure without revealing. Explain without detailing. Calm without transparency. That doesn't work long-term. Because reassurance without clarity feels hollow. And Meghan felt that hollowness immediately. This is where the fracture widened. Not through arguments. Through misalignment. Harry thought he was minimizing damage by staying vague. Meghan experienced that vagueness as avoidance. And avoidance, when trust is already strained, feels like confirmation. Confirmation that there's more he isn't saying. More he can't say. More that could resurface at any moment. Now ask yourself this. How do you rebuild trust when the original breach isn't just an action, but a system that can act again? Because this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was proof of vulnerability. Proof that external forces could still penetrate their shared boundaries. And that knowledge changes how you view every future decision. Suddenly, nothing feels guaranteed. Plans feel provisional. Commitments feel conditional. Unity feels fragile. And that fragility was impossible to ignore. Now let's talk about children. Because nothing clarifies fracture points faster than the question of protection. Meghan's instincts, by all accounts, are fiercely protective. Not performative. Primal. And when Harry returned from the palace, the unspoken fear wasn't about headlines. It was about exposure. Exposure to a system she believed had already proven it would prioritize optics over well-being. Exposure to expectations that don't stop at one generation. Exposure to a world she thought they had left behind for good. So when Harry couldn't say, with certainty, this will never happen again, the fracture deepened. Because certainty is what parents cling to when the world feels unstable. And Harry couldn't offer it. Not honestly. Now here's the part that makes this moment so pivotal. Neither of them was wrong. Harry genuinely believed he was preventing something worse. Meghan genuinely believed he had reopened a door that should have remained sealed. Those beliefs aren't incompatible intellectually, but emotionally, they collide. And collisions create damage. Because both people feel justified. Harry felt justified by necessity. Meghan felt justified by principle. And necessity versus principle is one of the hardest conflicts any marriage can survive. Necessity asks, what had to be done? Principle asks, what should never be done? And when those two questions produce different answers, compromise becomes nearly impossible. Now let's talk about communication, or rather, the lack of it. After the return, conversations didn't explode. They slowed. They became cautious. Both of them measuring words. Both of them avoiding certain topics. Because once you realize a topic can destabilize everything, you tiptoe around it. And tiptoeing creates distance. Not dramatic distance. Incremental distance. After this return, the relationship between Harry and Meghan was no longer defined by shared escape. It was defined by unequal access. The palace had access to Harry. Meghan didn't. That imbalance is corrosive because it creates a hierarchy where there shouldn't be one. And hierarchies inside marriages don't stay quiet. They demand resolution. Now here's where the story tightens. Harry didn't just break his promise to Meghan. He broke a promise to himself. And people who break promises to themselves often overcorrect. They become defensive. They become withdrawn. They become desperate to justify what they've done. You could see it in his behavior afterward. Less openness. More guarded responses. Avoidance of certain topics. Those aren't signs of clarity. They're signs of internal conflict. And internal conflict doesn't remain internal forever. It spills into tone, into decisions, into moments that don't seem connected until suddenly they are. So let me ask you this. If Harry broke his promise because he felt he had no choice, what happens when that feeling returns? Because systems like the palace don't apply pressure once. They test boundaries. They observe responses. They adjust. And this return gave them valuable information. It told them Harry would respond to urgency. It told them distance didn't equal immunity. It told them the door was not sealed. And once a door is proven functional, it becomes a tool. That's the danger Meghan saw immediately. Not just the return, but what it enabled. Now consider the emotional aftermath. Harry is torn. Meghan is furious. The palace is silent. That silence isn't peace. It's anticipation. Because the palace doesn't close chapters. It waits to see how they unfold. And unfolding requires time. Time for relationships to strain. Time for trust to erode. Time for choices to become unavoidable. Harry broke his promise not because he wanted to, but because something forced him to confront a truth he didn't want to face. The truth that leaving didn't sever every tie. The truth that independence is fragile. The truth that the past has a longer reach than he hoped. And that truth set off a chain reaction that no one could stop. Because once a promise like that is broken, the next decision becomes harder. And the one after that harder still. Which brings us to the most dangerous part of all. Harry's return wasn't the end of the pressure. It was proof the pressure worked. And now that it's worked once, the palace knows something it didn't know before. It knows where Harry's breaking point is. And knowing someone's breaking point is the most powerful leverage of all. Because what the palace did next wasn't loud. It wasn't public, but it was decisive. And when Harry realized what was being asked of him now, the stakes became impossible to ignore. This wasn't Harry's idea. That's the part most people miss. The secret return wasn't born out of nostalgia or regret. It wasn't a late-night emotional decision or a sudden change of heart. It was the result of a move made elsewhere, quietly, deliberately, by an institution that never stopped watching him. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever noticed how the palace never reacts the way you expect it to? When there's scandal, it waits. When there's outrage, it stays silent. When people demand answers, it offers none. But when it wants something, it doesn't ask. It creates conditions. And those conditions are what forced Harry's hand. Because the palace didn't say, "Come home." It said something far more effective. It said, "This can't be handled from where you are." That sentence doesn't sound threatening. It doesn't sound emotional. It doesn't sound coercive. But it is. Because embedded inside, it is a message Harry understands better than anyone else. You are still responsible.